أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Salam Media's broadcast of a conversation with El-Hajj Mauri Saalakhan. As you can see on the screen, I am not El-Hajj Mauri Saalakhan. Unfortunately, he was in a little bit of a accident today, and inshallah, he's asked me to be a guest host. My name is Mohammed Bashir. I'm a retired attorney, and it was my pleasure to step in the very big, profound shoes of someone as kind and gracious as Mauri Saalakhan. He had a very unique and intriguing lineup planned for today, and man plans and Allah is the best of planners. And unfortunately, we're unable to get to 3, 4, or even 5 members of this particular discussion on today. But the brothers that we have on today here on Salam Media are known to the community, and inshallah we'll have a very lively discussion. Salam Media is broadcast from out of South Africa, and it is a humanitarian journalism designed to add insight and knowledge and respect to the process of journalism so that the truth can be told and everybody can get a perspective that is here on this particular program uniquely Islamic. My guest today, however, on this particular program will be inshallah, Imam Yusuf Rios and Imam, excuse me, maybe I have the same thing that everybody else has. Imam Yusuf Rios and Imam Wesley LeBron. If we can get both of those brothers on, I'm going to, with the permission of everyone. I know how broad the topic was that we were all intending to discuss. That is a very broad topic of what is the major issue within the Islamic community now that we feel like we can address and maybe come to some conclusions on. But because it's only the 3 of us, I thought maybe we could just condense the conversation and maybe give that particular discussion to Brother Saalakhan when he's able to put together his full panel, because I'm sure he put that full panel together with an idea of getting very diverse, a very diverse discussion on what it is that we can do. So inshallah, if Imam Rios and Imam LeBron are on, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
First of all, welcome to you both, and I really do thank you for taking the time out. It's my understanding, and I told you both in text, that I'm tremendously jealous right about now. Tell the people where you are so that they can be jealous too, inshallah.
We're in the Caribbean, in Puerto Rico, alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.
Spiritual retreat.
May Allah bless the territory. Now, both of these imams are members of I believe it's called the 3 Puerto Rican Imams, correct? All right.
Yes.
And so you know, when things fell through on the entirety of the other panelists, the first thing that came to my mind was I got 2 Puerto Rican imams in Puerto Rico. And I thought about, you correct me if I'm wrong, Sheikh, Abu Dar comes to Rasulullah ﷺ and says, I want to deal with this Islam. And he says, go to your people, and when they're ready, bring them to me. And he goes to his people, leaves Mecca, goes there, and when they eventually, the Sahaba, eventually the Muslims migrate to Medina, somewhere in that migration or somewhere in the time of Medina, there's this horde of thunder coming through the desert. And it's Abu Dar and his tribe and another tribe, etc., that all embraced Islam by virtue of that. And I thought about it in light of the 2 of you, so that maybe we could start the conversation by asking Puerto Rican imams, how does your Islam connect with Puerto Rico? How is it that you become connected to Islam and you're still able to hold on to your Puerto Rican identity? Let's do it like that.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Firstly, we like to thank everyone, and we ask Allah to facilitate for those who can't be with us at the moment. The the question in reality, it's a lifelong struggle. It took us about 20 something years to figure that out. It was not necessarily that we had someone guiding us in the process of educating us in a way that we could understand what our journey was in terms of being individuals and also belonging to a tribal community. And we thank all those pioneers, especially from the African American community, that had put in the time to kind of work through those questions themselves and give people an experiential base. But what we've learned more and more is that throughout the years, the more profound lessons, and I'm speaking for both of us here, and Imam Wesley can correct me. There's some distinct points to make, but what we've learned, the more that we go deeper into the knowledge of Islam, the more that we're forced to confront ourselves and our own cultural realities in our own communities, our families, our peoples, our aunties, our uncles, our neighbors, and try to figure out where the common ground is. One of the things that's most impressive to me in these days, especially as a point of reflection, is that when we look at Jafar bin Abi Talib, Jafar, who was from the family of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when the companions asked permission of the Prophet to make a migration away from Medina, and they went to Africa, into Habasha, or the Habashian region at that time. They asked permission to remove themselves from the torment and the oppression that was there in Mecca. And when he went into that region, he found common ground with the people of the book. He didn't go in mentioning where were the differences that were at and how is it that they're wrong and this, that. That's not to say that he was compromising in the deen, but he found the common ground, and from there he was able to establish for the community a base of living and existing, and where they can continue to exist. And so when we look back, especially in that region of Africa, Habasha is has one of the largest concentration of Muslims and produces tons of scholars, by the way. A lot of people think that it's a Christian environment, and they really forget that it's, pretty much almost a Muslim majority area. And so from lessons like this, and from Muaz bin Jabal being sent to his people in Yemen, and the time that he took with his people, and the fact that Islamic legislation itself, how it came into the Arabian Peninsula in specific, how it dealt with the Meccan people, it dealt with them gradually. And we've seen with time, people came into Islam. We have had to learn those lessons, by making a lot of mistakes, that we have to learn how to deal with our people, our families, our communities. And we're on that journey itself, on that journey. And no matter how much we may want to hide in another culture or in another geographical location, we're forced back to confront ourselves and work that question out. And that's what we've been doing for the past 20 something years. And by a natural catastrophe that came about by Allah's permission, that's how we started the 3 Puerto Rican Imams to deal with the problems of Hurricane Maria. And Imam Wesley was already dealing with the Latino community head on, and working with the Latino Dawah. But it forced us to directly deal with our people and our community. And from there, we kept operating. But it's been a personal and a group process for over 2 decades now.
So you both have been intimately connected to the community here in the States as well. And so what's the connection there? What do you see that's consistent here in the States that's consistent with Puerto Rico? And I understand it's a territory, it's treated like less than a state, does not have statehood, but what do you see that's consistent here that we as Muslims can take away as we begin to deal with communities here?
So one of the things that is consistent is that we find a love for people, a love for your own people, right? So we see Maria was one of the biggest signs of that the people back home in the States, they stepped up like we've never seen before to make sure that the island and its people are going to be okay, right? And that comes from a sense of love, that comes from a sense of care, that comes from caring about the well-being of your people. And that's what Islam brings. Islam teaches us to care about our people.
I think they froze on me. Can you get them back? Yeah. Go ahead. Until you get them back, I'm going to keep talking because I want the audience to get an understanding of the interconnection between Islam and how it penetrates each and every community. It may penetrate your community different than it penetrates mine, but the fact is that Allah's qadr, Allah's message is universal. The question, though, is sometimes, in my opinion, hopefully we'll get to it, is whether or not we as a community, we as Muslims, treat it as too universal as opposed to going into the communities that actually need our help. Those of us who come from particular communities who can speak to that community wind up being spoken, our communities being spoken for by people who have no connection to our community, don't understand our community. Here you have two Puerto Rican Imams who are from both the Puerto Rican community and the American inner city urban community who can speak to those issues. Brothers, continue. Are you there? Can you connect?
Yeah, we can hear you. Sorry.
Alhamdulillah.
So what we see was that there was a care and love of our people. And we find that to be the same thing in Islam. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, when he gave Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam the revelation, he didn't send Muhammad to Spain. He didn't send them to Europe. He sent them to his people, to call his people and to invite his people to Islam, to bring them to the Tawheed of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, to bring them to the revelation of Allah Jalla wa Ala. And like Sheikh Yusuf said, it took us years to get to this point, right? Because we were trying to figure out those dynamics. But when we look at our culture, our people are people of faith, right? People who have a strong belief in God. Our people are people of values and morals, right? That when we look at Islam and we look at and we read the book of morals within Islam, you're going to find that a lot of those things are found already within our culture, right? So it wasn't an issue of embracing something so much different that was to us, but now it's just trying to figure out how do we get our people to understand the concept of the oneness of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, the concept of Islam, the concept that this religion is not something only for the Arabs, inshallah ta'ala, but that is for all of humanity, right? And one of the ways that we see that, in terms of da'wah is that to show that expression of love prior to inviting them to the message, right? If I come to your house and I knock on your door and I'm there to help you in your time of need, I'm there to feed you, I'm there to give you something, right? And then afterwards, you see within my character, you see within my actions, things that you may not normally see from other people, praying 5 times a day, saying Bismillah before you eat, all of these different types of things, you begin to ask questions. What is that type of behavior? What are you doing, right? SubhanAllah, just as the Prophet ﷺ was asked when he was coming out of Ta'if, what is that, right? This is, mashallah, the practice of Dhunnun, right? SubhanAllah. So we see that, SubhanAllah, in interacting with the people this way, we allow them to open up their hearts to us, their minds to us, and then we can bring in a conversation of, we're Muslim, and this is what Islam is all about.
That's a very powerful blueprint for us to take a look at. Let me just peel it a little bit, if you don't mind. As you are taking this journey, and as you are doing your best to represent the best of Islam for the people, the predominant culture has not been, or continues to not be, open to that type of expression. I recognize that our community is a community of faith. Our communities are communities of values. But apparently right now we take our values from the overarching culture. Here you are, you're in Puerto Rico right now. You guys are really struggling with whether or not you are a state, a territory, or something independent. And that particular dynamic is controlled by people who have different set of values or a different belief system as to who you are as a people. As you try to make this journey to try to get people to understand the Islamic da'wah, the Islamic thought process, how do they expect something from you? As, for example, maybe you run for Congress or something like that, something that impacts on the system. Are they looking for you to impact on the system, or are they looking for you to impact on their lives individually, or are they mutually exclusive?
I didn't understand the last part.
Are they the same? Are they the same dawah, or are they exclusive of each other?
Well, one of the things that on a personal level, and one of the things I'll say on a personal level is that, and I was telling you, the more that you go deeper into knowledge, and my reflections for a long time throughout my life, and I've been on this earth almost 5 decades now, 1 year short of 5 decades. And so on my reflection with myself, it has forced me to rediscover certain things. And one of the things I wanted to say was this, that when we talk about the Caribbean, we can't separate the Caribbean from Africa, and we can't separate the Caribbean from the rest of the Americas nor from Europe. And the Caribbean especially when you start talking about places like the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba, Puerto Rico, our tie-in to West Africa is extremely profound. And the same thing when you start looking at places like Brazil. Our tie-in to Timbuktu and Al-Andalus, if Al-Andalus would not have collapsed, and if Timbuktu was not taken over and invaded and so on and so forth, West Africa in general, we should say,
Right.
Our reality wouldn't be what it is today.
Right.
Firstly, the Caribbean and Latin America, or what became known to be Latin America, is deeply tied into what became the transatlantic slave trade, which initially meant that Muslims were being taken out. Tons of Muslims before other people, before other, the Yoruba tribe and others that were not necessarily practicing Islam, but tons of scholars were taken out of the Sokoto Empire and other regions in that close to that region, and they were brought into the Americas. And so what you found initially was between the indigenous peoples in the Caribbean and Muslims that were coming from West Africa was an alliance for justice.
Mm-hmm.
And this conversation about what do we do for justice began in Timbuktu when Imam Ahmed Baba was taken into slavery, and there was a discussion that took place between him and the Moroccan scholarship about whether Muslims could be enslaved or not. So a lot of what you see as far as justice has to do with that alliance between different peoples, even across religions, right? And so I began to have an understanding that even when we look at the interaction between Muslims and Timbuktu and the bickering that took place that eventually opened up to the collapse of Timbuktu, there's lessons in that for us today. What's happening to the Muslim community with a lot of the divisions is that they are falling prey in many ways to collapse internally.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have not explored enough in today's time, because of whatever reason, the boundaries that we put up or the fear. What does it mean to align with humanity to bring about better conditions for humanity itself? And that's why I find that the more I go deeper and the more I look at the prophetic mission, how the Prophet ﷺ in the Constitution of Medina initially was a pluralistic state. It was a place where there was an alignment between different peoples, even different creeds, on the basis of a just society. Even though the Muslims were taking the leadership, the Prophet in specific, alayhi salatu wasalam, there was a lot there to explore and have an understanding of us. We are ourselves as Muslims, we forgot all this potential that's there in our history and in our experience as peoples to put us in a situation where we can better understand what is our role today. A lot of us are trying to recreate the past versus extract from the past what's necessary for today's time period in order to preserve universals of the Quran. Because we have a principle in the Quran, la ikraha fi din. There's no compulsion in deen. And that was violated. I'm not going to apologize and say it wasn't violated, because we even had a situation where internally amongst Muslims, there were discussions where if you can enslave a Muslim or whether you can enslave a free person or not.
Right.
And so we violated our own principles of justice. Mm-hmm. That has nothing to do with Islam. That has to do with our shortcomings. Right. And we can't excuse ourselves as individuals, as human beings, as communities. When we violate principles of Islam, we're supposed to use those principles to renew ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so the more we become conscious of that, the more that we can function in the world in a different way. But it's not going to be the da'wah that we expect it to be. We're going to ourselves be exploring uncharted territory, because we're in a new time period. It's like one of the major scholars said in this time. He said, "Nahnu na'ish fi asr ghayr masbuq," that we're living in a time period which is unprecedented. The reality that we're experiencing on multiple levels, technologically, in terms of economy, in terms of mass migration, climate change, in terms of the different understandings that we have of human beings, the interaction between communities. Everything may seem like it has a precedence in the past, but it also has a current state which was not known before. Mm-hmm. So that's our challenge as Muslims, is to come into the time period and embrace the fact that the qadr of Allah brought us into this time period, and take our responsibility, our Quranic responsibility, on multiple fronts. One, the fact that as humanity, we're the Khalifa of Allah on the earth. And that doesn't mean like some political establishment. Talking about that we have as human beings a specific role on this earth. And we see it. The ability of the human being to be on the earth, to be on the ocean, to be in the air, to be under the earth. The human being is like unlike other animals. So we have to think about the Quranic expression of what it means to be a human being. And then we have to go into the whole idea of what is the role of this ummah. And in terms of the rest of the world. يعني كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس تعمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر وتؤمنون بالله واليوم الآخر. So Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala tells us that we have a role as an ummah, as a community, right, for humanity, but we have confused that point. And then Allah tells us in this regard that we enjoy what is good. We ourselves have to understand what is good on every level, not just telling people rules, because the Quran initially didn't come initiating rules. The Quran came and created a transformation in the orientation of how people saw human life and existence. Before rules became instituted, it took about 13 years before the command of Salah started to come in as a rule. The people were being reoriented in their character and the way that they were dealing with each other. And remember that this was revolutionary because a tribal society was being disintegrated and reintegrated. Tribal society means that people were together no matter good or bad. I'm with my people no matter what. And this society became a society, no, we stand with you and whoever on the basis of goodness and justice, not on the basis of just bloodline or tribe or lineage or what we would call today a racial understanding or ethnocentricity or bloodline pact, but it was a pact on values. So that type of reflection forces me to come out of my comfort box. And every time I come back, the non-Muslims, they teach me something and we contribute something back. And people are not comfortable with that type of dawah, but we're in the learning process. We're learning about how to better live our Islam, and we're learning about how to be better recapture the values of Islam and also give back. And we learned that. Just like in South Africa, there was some sort of alliance between Muslims and non-Muslims to bring about a better set of conditions. That precedent is there in many places throughout the world. You know what I'm saying? It was there when the Muslims that were in India, they were discussing about what to do with the situation of Muslims under British occupation. Is there between the Palestinian Christians and the Muslims. Is there on a lot of fronts between Malcolm X and when he would go into the black churches. Is there. It has been there for a long time, but many Muslims are not comfortable with that reality, and we have to be able to have that space and break out of our comfort zone to be able to reinitiate that.
That leads me to probably the whole concept of are we too universal in our thinking in Islam? Meaning that we understand what Rasulullah, the Sahaba, the Tabi'een, what they were able to accomplish, and therefore we look to the idea of a ummah as opposed to an idea of a community first, an idea of a group first. Are we too universal in our thought processes, especially in these days of times, considering you say these are unique times? I mean, think about it. Flash back to what you discussed as Sokoto. When you talked about Sokoto, you talked about the Hausa land and that the people who overthrew basically each one of those governments, or at least each one of those movements, turned out to be either Muslims with a different ideology, a different thought process. Those of us who grew up in the 60s, we saw the same or similar kind of thought process with Dar al-Islam. When the Immigration Act of 65 comes along and they begin to import Muslims and who wanted to be Imams and lead the community here, when there was a vibrant so-called African-American or so-called Black Islam going here that was separate and apart. And I'm not talking about any nation of Islam. I'm talking about an indigenous Sunni community. And we saw a lot of that, and that created a divide in the Muslim community. Are we too universal in hoping that everybody will embrace us, as opposed to what I saw when the hurricane? I saw Puerto Rican people gathered together to pass out bread, and if they didn't have a 503c, they went out and they just gathered money in baskets and went out and fed people. And to me, that's the best kind of dawah that could possibly be. The Muslims being in the forefront of something like that would be a very, very powerful statement. So are we too universal in our hopes, or are we just missing the idea that we start small and we work our way toward a bigger and better Islam?
In my opinion, Akhi, is that, subhanAllah, I think we're just missing the point altogether, right? And this was something that we had to realize as Puerto Rican Muslims, that if we don't come back and we don't help our people and we don't invite our people, then who will? I've been Muslim 25 years now, right? To be here on the island, calling my people to Islam, that was a dream that I had 25 years ago that I didn't know if it would manifest during my time or not, right? And Allah allowed it to manifest during our time. And as Sheikh Yusuf was mentioning, right, this is on many different fronts. This isn't just showing up to feed people and showing up to give them help in the times of need, but we were out there marching when they wanted to get rid of Ricky, right? When they had that million people march, Yusuf showed up. A lot of people showed up. You know what I mean? We were out there supporting, right? So it's in supporting that good. Right now, they're talking about privatizing the beaches that belong to the country, right? So we're in support of non-privatization of the beaches as well, right? Because that belongs to the people, inshallah ta'ala, right? And then you have those from outside trying to come in and make money on from the country because it's beautiful. It's a beautiful place, and they turned it into a place of tourism. And the next, we end up like Hawaii, right? So we had to look at that in the sense of now we have to work on a bunch of different fronts, and we have to take out of our minds what the larger body of Muslims is thinking. Because in the beginning, they would ask us, why are you going there? They don't believe in Islam. They're not Muslims, right? And I said, well, I didn't believe in Islam when I wasn't Muslim 25 years years ago either, right? But someone cared enough to come and talk to me about Islam. They had enough love in their heart to come and share that with me, to try to come down to my level where I was at and, have the same experiences that I have, because I was invited by another Puerto Rican to Islam. And alhamdulillah, we was able to relate. And I accepted Islam, mashallah, by his hands after Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. And alhamdulillah, now have been able to do a lot of things. So I think that, in terms of the larger body of Muslims, I think we have hopes of coming together as a unified ummah, but we haven't learned to come together in our smaller body of communities, especially when it comes to making larger impact, where if we come together, as a small community, the impact we can make is extreme, right? And I think us as the 3 Puerto Rican Imams, and this is not praising ourselves at all whatsoever, 3 Imams opened up an organization to do what many people thought was impossible, to come here to help out in Puerto Rico, and then that extended to, mashallah, helping out in Haiti, helping out in Hawaii, helping out in South America, helping out in Palestine, Nigeria, Africa, Pakistan, right? And it turned into something completely different, just from 3 brothers having hopes to going out and touching the hearts of people, inshallah ta'ala, and then finding within the community people who had the same mission and purpose, who would support that mission and purpose, so that we can go ahead and make, mashallah, a larger statement and a larger impact on the world.
Muhammad,
Alhamdulillah.
I wanted to, I don't know if we have time, but I wanted to touch on what you asked as well.
Please, go ahead.
I think that when, the question is in its proper place, and that question in reality is a question that's often brought up in Black Muslim thought, because there's such a thing as Black Muslim thought. And a lot of the time, that question, I feel it comes from trying to reflect on where was the community during Malcolm's time, Malcolm X, and post-Malcolm, and why have things broken down. And Islamic thinking in general, in a more general sense, there's a concept that's called fiqh al-awlawiyat. It's called fiqh al-awlawiyat, or the understanding of priorities. And I think that that's where we fall short. Even the concept of membership and identity is very confused. A lot of us have been heavily impacted by some political concepts which came from the Muslim world. Like Sayyid Qutb had an idea that we're Muslim and that's it, that's our nationality.
Right.
And so in reality, that was born out of a need in Egyptian society, but that's not necessarily the prophetic stance. And I'm not here to critique or praise Sayyid Qutb.
Right.
But what I'm saying is that there's ideas that come and they shape the way that we think. So that idea, when we come and we say we're just Muslim, that's it. What that does is it rips us from our family. It rips us from our tribe. It rips us from our community. That lady that was a non-Muslim that used to clean our butts when we were children, and she made sure that we didn't play in the street or danger come to us, all of a sudden she becomes an enemy. The other issue is that's the identity piece. The other issue is that when we come to understand Quran and the Sunnah, there's a lot of understanding that is generalized of the Quran and the Sunnah. Like, for instance, the idea of the mushrik and the idea of the kafir. A lot of times these ideas are generalized, and the nuances that are even in the Quran and the Sunnah are completely displaced. So what that does is it puts us at odds with people in the world. Then when it comes to us having priorities, we lack priorities for how we should function on a practical level. You know what I'm saying? And that's the difference between what we saw with Malcolm. Malcolm was an extremely intelligent, genius type of person. And I consider Malcolm to be a reviver of the deen on many fronts. That's another conversation. But Malcolm at one point in time said something for a lot of people would be disgusting. He said, we leave our religion at home. And it's not that he was promoting some sort of deviation from it. It's that if you really think about what he was calling to, he was talking about calling to the common ground values, and that allowed Malcolm to be able to function with other communities.
You're breaking up.
Which is something that to do, huh?
You're breaking up, but inshallah, I caught most of that. But I think the audience caught most of that. But you're beginning to break up, and I don't want them to miss your important point.
So Malcolm was able to figure out where the common ground was with other people, even if the language was something that would make Muslims feel uncomfortable.
Right.
But he had the understanding that we had to be at a working level with Muslims and non-Muslims. Unity, especially he was talking to the black community.
Mm-hmm.
Unity had to be with the Muslims and the non-Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And so what that means practically is what we need to focus on and remove ourselves from too much of an ideological, idealistic understanding of Islam and even the idea of ummah. And that comes back to the point that you were making, are we too universal?
Right.
And so the issue of, it's not that we're too universal, is the issue that we don't understand where our priorities are and how to function on a practical level, and also use language to be able to bridge the gap between people. Mm-hmm. Because the reality is that we're not, as much as people want to return to the past is not going to return as it was. We're obligated to live in the present, what the command of Allah is for us in today's time, and how to reach the pleasure of Allah in this context, which is a job, it's a task, it's burdensome, you know, and it does come with some hardship, but it needs the scholarship, leadership, and the people that have these types of dialogues and push the boundaries, right, so that we're able to get to a position of growth and practice.
Oh, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. You know, it's funny you mentioned El-Hajj Malik Shabazz. He was buried by my uncle Hajj Hisham Jabber, and I remember him telling us when I was maybe 10 that this isn't a hadith, but it came from him. It was the first time I heard it, that every kafir is one shahada away from being your brother in Islam, you know. So and we in the Muslim community held on to that, especially after the assassination of Malcolm X, when we had to go over there and claim, and the family had to go over there and claim the body. But let me just sidetrack just a little bit. Sheikh Yusuf, you did a lecture in relationship to the unfortunate murder that occurred in Philadelphia last week. My understanding that a group of teenagers, about 3 girls, 4 boys, beat an old man in the head with some cones from off the street. He eventually succumbed to that. They're all going to be charged as adults. Right. Now, you know, obviously I have an intimate connection with criminal justice, so that kind of stuff always rings with me. Explain to the audience what the overarching message that you were trying to get across there.
The overarching message, and I think this relates heavily, you know, to the South African community. It relates to a lot of communities, is that in reality, what's happening in today's time is that communities are being overtaken by violence. But the address of the Muslim community to social problems is almost nowhere to be found. You have people that are doing it. We're not negating that people are doing good work, but it's not impactful. And so in specific, when you talk about a city like Philadelphia, I was born in Philadelphia. And so a city like Philadelphia has had years of work in which work was being put into that community to change the conditions. And what has happened is that because of the way that we're looking at life, we're not addressing issues that go beyond a certain type of scope. So we can't, for instance, if we're not addressing family breakdown, if we're not addressing our economic situation, if we're not addressing our role in the city and in the society, if we're not addressing the stability of our neighborhood, if we're not addressing mental health issues, if we're not addressing a balanced, viable, practical, healthy, way of practicing Islam where people can be functional, what happens is that our communities become open to be influenced by a lot of other things, and in specific, our youth. And so what we're seeing is a retrogression in terms of social conditions. We're seeing, rather than Islam help to ameliorate the conditions of life, that's the meaning of Islam, to bring about a better set of conditions. We're seeing that our youth now are being caught up in that wave of violence and destructive energy that is there in a lot of different communities, because we are dealing with real social problems. Mm-hmm. So ignoring the social problems, ignoring the necessity of really focusing on individual development and the family, and focusing on economy, and focusing on building safe communities, and focusing on our development. Mm-hmm. This is opening us up to a situation which now we're losing multiple generations, because on the cultural front, we're irrelevant. On popular culture, has a great impact on the psyche of young Muslims. And also, we're in many places, even in the Muslim world, we don't have economic opportunities to offer the youth. And so what's happening is that people are falling into a spiritual crisis with themselves because the meaning of life for them is being challenged, right? And so the message that I want to give is that we really have to pause before we lose another 1 to 2 generations. We already lost a couple of generations before us. So we're about to lose another couple generations, which will put us about 100 years back in terms of the da'wah. And we will be facing a social crisis and a mental health crisis that's not going to be workable for us, because now we're seeing suicide in the Muslim community, we're seeing drug addiction, we're seeing sex addiction, we're seeing people confused about their identity on multiple levels, and we're seeing displacement of large amounts of Muslims. You know, so the Muslim community, its foundations are being rocked. So in specific, when it comes to the Black and the Latino community, and in general, when it comes to the rest of the Muslim community, we need to focus on what is going to be that which holds up our community. And if the priorities of our da'wah and our message and our cultural generation, where we put our money, where we put our decision, where we put our time, is not for the preservation of our existence and the development of our existence, because that's one of the objectives of the Sharia, right? If it's not for the protection of life and the development of life, for the protection of the deen and the development of the deen, if it's not for the protection of family and the development of the family, the protection of dignity and development of human dignity, and the same thing with wealth and so on and so forth, then we've lost the general principles that will allow us to be functional in this time period. And unfortunately, what we have seen is that what Malcolm was pulling the community out after so many decades in Sunni Islam, we're falling to the same problem. But now we like to preach that we have the right understanding of who God is. But life itself is being taken away from us, literally. And we are becoming the cause to the destruction of the life of the general community, like that young boy who now is going to be charged as an adult for the murder of an elderly man in a city which is predominantly Muslim. You know what I'm saying? And so that creates a deep concern. It's not going to be a one-man solution, but we're going to have some real tough conversations about what it is that we're not doing and what it is that needs to be done.
So do you think, so check my analogy out here. Do you see that incident with this young Muslim boy in the same light as you see the necessity of coming together when you had the hurricane in Puerto Rico? That the Muslim community has to rally on that same level. If you just see one example like that, that should be enough to make the community rally.
The problem that we have in this situation, Ustad Muhammad, is that this is the undermining of society. When you talk about the taking of life, it doesn't matter whose life it is.
Right.
Then what we have here at this point in time is the destruction of society.
Right.
And that could maybe happen on the political level, the economic level, or the individual level, or a group level, a hatred level. Once we get to that point in a society, regardless of who's doing it, then we're headed down an extremely difficult, arduous path of coming back to human dignity, because the value of life itself is being lost to a new generation. It's different if you have an adult, and I'm not excusing it, you know what I'm saying? But when you have a youth, that's the values that they have cultivated. That means that's emblematic, symbolic, indicative of a series of youth that are being impacted by some culture, which is embedding that in their practice and their outlook on life, to the point where they don't have a boundary. That's an elderly person, to the point where they feel as though they're not even thinking of the consequences of their actions, that this can result in this and this, and they're not even thinking about the preservation of their own lives and their own freedom, and so on and so forth. So somewhere along the line, we have failed as Christians, as Muslims, as atheists, as secularists, as revolutionaries, whatever ideology you want to talk about. It's a failure of society itself. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And then when we talk about the Muslim community itself, the breakdown of the family, you understand what I'm saying? And how it is that we're not able to even bring in or reel in our youth so that they have an understanding of how it is that they should traverse life.
Right.
So it should be a social conversation. And then more specifically, violence in the U.S. has always been a problem, but it's something that we fail to address.
Right. But here's what I'm thinking, so that you get the analogy. Emmett Till is murdered. His mother opens up the casket so the world could see it, setting off the civil rights movement. A young Muslim boy apparently is lost to the community. Now, sometimes Allah gives us extremes so that we have to rally. In this particular case, for a 14-year-old boy to be missing the basics, fundamentals of the elderly, of the compassion, of the and falling victim to the group consciousness, the gang consciousness, to whatever consciousness that's out there, it seems to me that that's a rallying cry, a screaming out to us, like it's time for your Emmett Till movement. It's time, the same way that hurricane was a rallying cry for Puerto Ricans, the same way that
there's no doubt. There's no doubt about that. There's no doubt about that. That's a situation which, and you know, forgive me for disrupting you, but that's a situation which you shouldn't have to build a case for. No. Our human instincts and where our ethical impulse should be at is automatically we should know this. More specifically, this is a serious problem, and some people may get mad at me, but this is an indication as to the fact that there's genocidal tendencies in the Black community that are very real, that are not being addressed by the Muslims, by the Muslim leadership itself, because you have intergenerational violence there that's taking place. And of course, part of it is social conditions, but at the same time, these issues fail to be addressed as being a priority, like what you're saying, on the level of the Muslims, on the level of the Black Muslim community, on the level of the Black community, the Latino community, and the general society. And that's really what's troublesome, that when life is taken like that, and not only that, on top of the dehumanization that occurs with that type of situation, it was broadcasted. They recorded it.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So we're at another level where there's a breakdown, which is we're failing to address it. And it's the same issue when you talk about internalized oppression, which ends up being like suicide or whatever. We're seeing homicide in the same way. So we're in a real risky time period, but we don't get the point. You know what I'm saying? Unfortunately.
You know, one of the things I think, Akhi, is that unfortunately, you know, we don't find these issues to be our issues as Muslims. Just be 100%. Let's be 100% real, right? If that whole analogy with Emmett Till and opening the casket and turning into a civil rights movement, right? The Muslims aren't usually jumping aboard these different types of things because we don't find it to be beneficial to our community, right? There's some fear when it comes to the immigrant community. There's fear there because can I be deported? Can I be taken out of the country? Will my comfort level be removed from me, right? Will I lose my good home? I lose my good job for speaking out and saying something, right? It takes a place of iman. That takes a place of faith and certainty. Allah will say, no, I'm going to stand up for what's right. I'm going to stand against what's wrong, right? And all of these things are worthy of my time and worthy of my cause. Just like helpful fudul, the Prophet said, if it were to take a place during my prophethood, I would be there in the home, you know, supporting the other tribes against injustice and oppression, right? But we're not looking at things that way, right? Unfortunately. And this is why oftentimes, you know, we're kind of, we think about communal things kind of when it's a benefit to, you know, their people, benefit to other people, inshallah ta'ala. But when it comes to now, us, the indigenous Muslims, us, you know, the blacks, the Latinos, the likes, you know, it's like, well, okay, they're not our people, right? So they'll come out if there's going to be some type of financial benefit, if there's going to be some type of, you know what I mean, recognition benefit, inshallah ta'ala, in terms of governmental or whatever it may be, they'll come out, they'll do something small so that they can be recognized. Overall, move out of the
breaking up again, Shay.
And these are the things that
Mr. Engineer, see if you can clean that up. All right. Mr. Engineer is going to try to clean that up. The reason why I'm addressing this particular level of conversation is, again, because you're talking to two imams who have taken community personally. They have taken the impetus to go into communities and try to build from the grassroots up, to try to be the example on the grassroots up. That requires character. That requires a good understanding of Islamic character. And many people aren't persuaded about Islam by virtue of your knowledge, as more so than they are historically by your actions, by what you do in aid of them, what you do in respect of them, how you respect the surroundings that you're in. And dawah, inshallah, is, and Allah knows best. If we look back through the history, especially in the migration of Muslims throughout the world as they began to move from the original Sahaba, people were impressed by their example, the examples that they set in trade, in honesty, in integrity, in stopping during the course of the day to pray. I never forget, you grow up praying all your life, and then all of a sudden you get to the Hajj, and the Adhan goes off, and everything stops. So all my life, I'm praying. But when I get to the Hajj, is the first time that everything stopped to pray, and literally people's praying in their cars, praying opposite their cars. And it was like mind blowing. And I went to Hajj at 53. And I was 53 years old. So imagine a whole lifetime of praying and, okay, I'm gonna make it to the masjid, etc. But to see everything just stop, and just everybody begin to pray is an example that just is mind blowing, and to me, that's the essence of Islam. I remember the first time I really began to wear my kufi, 11 years old, when the parents gathered to go claim the body of Malcolm X. That was the first sense of real Islamic pride. I mean, you raise up, you go to Islamic classes, etc. But to see the brothers gather for that, to get ready, knowing the threats that were out there, to go say, we're going to New York to claim our brother, was like, wow, I want to be that. And the example sometimes is, well, actually all the time to me, is better than the wording. So the actions that you put forward are much better than the wording. Continue, Sheikh. I think we lost you some of what you were saying.
Yeah, so again, my point, man, is that we need to be able to stand up, for justice and against oppression when that calls for it, not just when it's convenient to us. And we find that that's the case with the larger Muslim body, right? That we find that when it's convenient, they'll stand up, especially when it's calling to their own causes or for their own people. But when it calls to the, indigenous, Latino, or Black, that's not always the case. Right. One of the biggest complaints we got after Maria here in the island of Puerto Rico is we've always supported Palestine, right? Here in Puerto Rico, you see they march for Palestine and march for the rights of Palestine. And they said, now after Maria, where are the Muslims for us? Right. And it's valid. It's valid, right? So we can have them stand up for us, but now when it's time for us to stand up, with their against their oppressors, we're silent, right? We're not involved, right? And we need to change that. And we have to stop looking at how can we strip the people of their identities, which is one of my biggest issues, right? As a Puerto Rican Muslim, I showed up one time and the brother says, yeah, Imam, why don't you have a thobe and a kufi on? And I told him, I said, let me ask you a question. I said, the African Muslims, how do they dress? They got their cultural wear, mashallah. They wear their beautiful colors, their pants, their shirts, mashallah. I said, how do the Arabs dress? They got their thobes. The Pakistanis, how do they dress? They got their qamis and their pantalon, right? Their white gear, mashallah. I said, why is it that we have to look like everybody else? Right. Why is it that we can't have our own identity, inshallah ta'ala? I said, my long beard, every time I come into Puerto Rico, the first question they ask me, are you Arab? Right? Which is a door for me to open up for dawah. Right? No, I'm not Arab. I'm from here. I'm from among y'all, but I am Muslim. Right. Mashallah, right? So I think we just need to really, man, kind of change the thought process that we have, and that thought process of, I'm only going to stand up when it's a benefit for me and my cause, and when it's not, I'm going to go ahead and sit back and see what happens. And in all honesty, this is what I see that takes place among the Muslims, unfortunately.
So let me work that with you. George Floyd, we stand up for that?
Absolutely. I went out to Newark and I actually got a talk that I recorded, I gave right after the murder of George Floyd, inshallah ta'ala. Actually, to stand up for that.
Actually, that's a good point. I was going to bring that up with the whole Black Lives Matter thing. We were confused on how to function with that. Not necessarily us, but a lot of people were confused on how to function with that.
You reading me. I was going there.
I used my position, and I went out and I heard every excuse from the Muslim community on that front. You know what I'm saying? They support this, they support that, and the issue was, we're talking about the destabilization of society. We're talking about the violation of human rights. We're talking about people dying. You understand what I'm saying? We're talking about sending a message back to society that we need to correct ourselves, and more specifically, that we need to address the situation of black men in this society, right? But because our intellectual glasses, or the paradigm that we operate from, or the vision that we have, or the attitude that we have, or the theology that we have, you know, all of that creates a filter that blocks us from being able to be functional to our situations. When we talk about being people that are from the Americas, indigenous people, see, the immigrant community, in part they get a pass go card, in part they don't, because they're still trying to figure out where they belong after displacement. But that doesn't mean that they get a complete pass go card. But the indigenous community, what do you do with that? Do we continue to give ourselves an excuse and say, well, it's been systematic efforts have been made to kind of bring us out of the sphere of consciousness, so we really don't understand properly? We need to no, we don't get a pass go card, because then we will never take responsibility for ourselves and our families and our community. We will always fall into that reality of blaming someone else. But that doesn't mean also that we just fall into where a lot of Muslims are at now, which is leaning to the right, which is saying just personal responsibility. No, there's systemic issues. There's systemic issues, and there's personal will issues on both fronts. And that's where I think El-Hajj Malika Shabazz, rahmatullahi alayhi, he taught us that reality very clearly. And he hit on both fronts. But our theology, our understanding of Aqidah, our understanding of the practice of deen, our understanding of political culture, our understanding of social responsibility is devoid of all of that, right? It's devoid of those two fronts. So we find ourselves, like one activist brother recently, he reached out to me. He's not Muslim. He said, I've been following you for a while. But he let me know that he was having a breakdown. And that's what happens. When we don't have the right balance in place, we burn out. We end up burning out from trying to be socially responsible. And Islam teaches us to function on both fronts: individual responsibility and community responsibility, which includes our family and the rest of society. And it does not discriminate or show prejudice when it comes to the issue of humanity. That's where a lot of us, we need to decolonize our mindset. The geopolitical reality has made us negate humanity because of what's happening in the Muslim world. And we have to realign to humanity again, you know, to the nature of human beings, because the human being is the creation of Allah. And so we have to be able to stand up for life first before we can even talk about religious values on the other fronts. If we can't stand up for life, then there's a big defect in our deen. And standing up for life is not just its existence, but it's also the dignity of the human being. You know, لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي Adam, the Quran says that we have honored the children of Adam. And Imam Qarafi al-Maliki went to the extent of saying that human dignity is preserving it and cultivating human dignity is from the objectives of the deen itself. And that's what Malcolm taught us: the brotherhood of humanity, the importance of justice, the importance of human dignity, the importance of being in a society which recognizes that dignity and standing up for that. You know, and those are things that unfortunately, for whatever reason, the Muslims have lost out on. And I personally think it's because the Muslims themselves are in a geopolitical situation which is dehumanizing. And not enough people are doing the work intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually to address those conditions. Allah knows best.
Tell me, so just as a final question, look at the spheres that we all exist in as Muslims. We exist in a culture that is dominated by racism, white supremacy. We have a political system. We have, I mean, you're right there in Puerto Rico. You all are trying to get Congress to pass legislation that would even allow you to have meaningful, to be able to get benefits when you move from New York to Puerto Rico by the latest Supreme Court case. They literally told the guy he had to pay $28,000 back on benefits that he could get as a citizen in the United States, but he couldn't take those benefits to Puerto Rico. In fact, when he did it in Puerto Rico, they said he had to pay it back. Again, we're talking, that's a political question, though. That's trying to put the right congressperson in. Are Muslims able to function? Are Muslims, just in your opinion, is it a necessity that we function on the levels, on all the levels that you discussed that are impacting? Or are we right now too secular, or do we need to be secular as it relates to that?
It's a necessity and an obligation. A necessity for مقومات الحياة. For that, the basic needs that are necessary for life itself is necessary for us to address these issues. But it's also an obligation ethically from the side of the deen for us to be able to address these issues because of what's good and just in terms of what the human being needs. So it's two fronts. It's just like a default position that you need water in life to exist and you need food. So these things in the modern state are necessary in order to function.
But
addressing these types of conditions.
Let me interrupt you. But the system playing, I don't want to give the devil any credit, so I'm just going to play an advocate. But the system in and of itself is corrupt. The system in and of itself is dominating Muslim communities. It's exploiting Muslims around the world. It's killing Muslims. It's miseducating black people. It's incarcerating black people at high rate. It's a corrupt system. To enter that particular system, do we enter that system or do we find a way around it?
But there's 2 points here, I think, or there's 3 points. There's 3 points actually. One, there's the reality of what's going on, the reality of what's going on, and it has to be understood properly. That's necessary to properly understand what's going on. The second thing is, after we understand what's going on, do we understand how the deen addresses that reality or not? Mm-hmm. And then there's the third front of actually engaging,
right? Which
is another front. So that 3-tier reality has to be there in place. Our scholarship in reality is not at that level. Mm-hmm. Our leadership overall, general leadership is not at that level. Our activists are not at that level many times. Mm-hmm. And there's a disjuncture between really لا نشخص الواقع على طريقة صحيحة. Like we don't characterize reality in the right way. And so that's why in the Muslim community, a lot of people have gone right, and they want to deny that there's systemic issues. They consider that a Marxist plot, or they consider there are no systemic issues. It's just the individual that is responsible for himself, and there's no qualms of the past. There's no issues that took place in the past that people should be beefing about, so to speak. So there's a certain way of looking at life. You have to remember, after the fall of Al-Andalus, many Muslims lost the social conscious aspect. Even if we were to take Ibn Khaldun as a paradigm, look at the contradictions in Ibn Khaldun's thought. Mm-hmm. You understand what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It gives us a paradigm for saying, yes, Islam is more than just talking about spirituality. Mm-hmm. And Islam is about, the Quran teaches us to think about how civilization rises and falls and how communities are built, and unity in a community and what it takes, and the impact of geography and culture and economy and ideas. All of that should be part of how we examine the world. But we've lost that. And so we've had a lot of discourse on Islam in the last 100 years that's not holistic and is not allowing us to flourish. Mm-hmm. It's not talking about human flourishing. And so when we talk about that front, we need to come back to first, how is our thinking empowering us and our practice empowering us? Mm-hmm. And Shaykh Taha Jabir in fiqh al-aqalliyat, or the fiqh of Muslim minorities, he said all our fatwas and our practices should be about empowerment of a community which is quantitatively small. Mm-hmm. So that community is up against the wall of survival, and it can't just be bent on survival. It has to flourish and grow. So Islamic scholarship, which will include the general Muslim community, which are intellectuals and those who are specialized in the sciences of the Quran and the Sunnah, have to come together on that front of understanding how to talk about politics and economy and society. And then we have to produce a response. We see how it's going to be tested in life. We lost it. That's just the reality. Right. And so we have activists on one front, we have scholars on the other front, spiritual guys on another front, the general professional body on another front. And there's not a collective effort at bringing our resources together to be able to tap into our potential so they become actuality. And I know this is very theoretical, but is a matter of laying out a framework to see where it is that we're falling short. You see on that front.
Also one of the things I think is that, in terms of whether we get involved or not, I don't think there's any question on whether we get involved or not. I think we have to get involved, right? But I think sometimes we think that we have to get involved at the higher levels initially, Congress and the likes, and we kind of forget about the power moves that we can make on a small level, the council, mayor, right? Because if we get into these smaller positions, inshallah ta'ala, that have smaller responsibilities within the cities, right? And then we begin to tie ourselves into, mashallah, bringing forth change, right? But as long as we stay out all together and we don't get involved, then we're just victims to whatever it is that they plan for us or against us. And how do we change that?
Or of our own thinking, victims of our own thinking, because Islam, the problem is that Islam doesn't forbid us from engaging. That came from the mistakes of the Islamic movement,
right?
And how they were dealing with the idea of establishing the Islamic State. The Islamic movement, that thinking that came before in the 70s and the 60s and the 50s, and even carried into the 80s, is not suitable thinking for the 21st century. That thinking is outdated. It was tested. It failed. No Islamic State came out of that. No political sovereignty came out of that. As a matter of fact, it ended up leading a lot of the Islamic movement efforts that were NGO efforts that were dealing with society to be collapsed, because they didn't know how to integrate the political front with the social front, in terms of servicing society. That's not the case in Black Muslim thought. Black Muslim thought, if we look at the example of Imam Waradeen, or if we even look at what Malcolm tried to do, and some people may not like that you bring that up, those examples show that you can still be functional, be there. And the Imam Waradeen community, there was always, in my dealing, always an advocacy of, always advocating to be part of the city, to be part of this administration, to have legit organized institutions, whether it's a nonprofit organization or whether it's some sort of business. There was always that thinking in place. That was not tapped into. And that was not tapped into in part because of the way that Dawah was taught from overseas. When it came in, it clashed with what the Black Muslim community was doing in the U.S. And it displaced us based on religion.
Yes.
On religious understanding, not Islam necessarily, but people's religious understanding and what someone else was saying and someone else was interpreting. And so that's, again, if we get back to those basics, because some of the higher level thinking, it doesn't need to be for everybody. That confuses the people. We have to have a way of speaking that's clear and actionable for the general public. And then we can work out more deeper intellectual problems and all of that, and scholarship issues, in a space where that's worked out. But the Imams and Mashaykh have created that problem as well. They have confused the people with the back and forth on religion.
Very, very good. Excellent. Look, I really do appreciate you brothers coming on. Excellent conversation. I'm looking forward to the day when we have a street corner symposium as opposed to an ICNO mass. We're going to do it on the street corner. We can do it here in D.C. in Prince George's County. You all can come. I'll bring all the street corner imams and we'll try to figure out a way to get this all straightened out. May Allah bless you both. Enjoy Puerto Rico. I'm getting ready to go out here in Maryland where there's a rainstorm. So I really am jealous, in case you wanted to know. May Allah have mercy on you.
But both, you can come with us on the next leadership retreat.
That's what I wanted to hear. Look, Saalakhan.
Assalamu alaikum to everyone.
Time for me to sum up. Look, Mauri Saalakhan is a giant in our community, and we thank him for this opportunity. We pray that he is well and safe, and that he's not upset by the fact that we adjusted his conversation, because believe me, when he sets up a conversation, we want it to be his. And since he was the one who set it up, we adjusted it just for that purpose, so he could get the benefit of the great work that he does. He always finishes here on the Salam Media by reciting Surah Al-Asr, and so we will do that as well, inshallah. And we say, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, wal 'asr innal insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa 'amilus salihati wa tawassaw bil haqqi wa tawassaw bis sabr. And we wish you nothing but peace and blessings as we sign off here on a conversation with El-Hajj Mauri Saalakhan. Assalamu alaikum.